Madam President, I should probably know better than to push my voice beyond where I've taken it today. But I want to add a little bit more about Memorial Day. I just spoke about Sam Bryce and Buzz Otis and a tribute to them. We just recognized Memorial Day last week in our respective states. I was pleased to be with many Alaskans gathered as we observed Memorial Day. We clearly revere those who serve in our military. In Alaska, we're home to more veterans per capita than any other state in the Union. And this year I was privileged to host a very distinguished veteran at Alaska's official state veterans memorial. This is located at a place called Byers Lake, which is midway on the Parks Highway between Fairbanks and Anchorage. It's extraordinarily picturesque. It's very tranquil. It is almost a spiritual place in many, many ways as you look out to Denali in the background, but being surrounded by the memorials for honoring those veterans who have served us. But I was able to bring to that gathering last Sunday a very distinguished veteran. That was our Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Ryan Zinke, a former Navy SEAL. So this following week, just on Sunday, I was able to do yet another Memorial Day, if you will. And our focus was not on those who gave their lives on foreign soil, but in a battle for American soil. And our focus this past Sunday was on what is known as the forgotten battle of World War II. It was the bombing and it was the subsequent occupation of the Aleutian Islands of Alaska by Japan. It was a year-long campaign, and for those of us in Alaska, it is a campaign that we often speak about, that we share the stories, that many who are still around today are sharing the stories with us, kind of the living legends, if you will. But I recognize that for many, if you were to ask them whether or not the United States has ever been occupied, were we occupied in World War II, I think unfortunately the name, the forgotten war, may just exactly be that they didn't recognize that the Aleutians were occupied by the Japanese, that many in our communities were killed in defending our homeland, and many were either transported to Japan as prisoners of war or relocated to the southeastern coast of our state, 1,000 miles away. So making sure that this forgotten war is not forgotten is an important part of our nation's history. Again, that Aleutian Campaign was a year long, fighting weather and terrain with equipment that was clearly not up to the challenge, but to reclaim U.S. territory from a determined Japanese force. So a little bit to the history. On June 3rd, 1942, Japanese forces bombed Dutch Harbor and over the succeeding days occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska. So these islands were occupied by native peoples who had been there 1,000 years. It was not until May of 1943 that Attu was retaken. 549 U.S. and Allied troops were killed in combat, but there's evidence that the U.S. and Allied losses were really quite higher as a result of exposure, disease, Japanese traps, friendly fire, frostbite. The elements out there in the Aleutians, let me just tell you, are particularly harsh, and when you don't have the equipment, it makes it even more so. The war in the Aleutians came at a great price for our native people who had lived on those lands for thousands of years before the war. Homes were burned, churches were burned. 881 of the Aleut residents of 9 separate villages were relocated to abandoned mining and fishing camps in southeastern Alaska, where they were forced to live under some pretty tough conditions. And at the remembrance event that I attended in Unalaska on Sunday, some of the evacuees were at the ceremony. They were there, they shared their stories about what it meant to literally be ripped from your village without having any idea what was really going on, and sent to an area that may have been a foreign country to them. If you're on the Aleutian Islands, your environment is entirely different than a cannery in Funter Bay in Alaska. But what was extraordinary about these evacuees was, despite the really harsh and difficult and in many cases horrible conditions that they were under, they never gave up. They didn't give up hope, and they certainly didn't give up their patriotism. 25 men from the evacuated villages chose to join the fight. 3 men joined the retake of Attu. All were awarded the Bronze Star for their valor. I think it's important to remember that there's so many lessons to be learned from the Aleutian Campaign. America once perceived itself as a nation oceans away from foreign threats. And today, I think it's unthinkable for us to think that any of our territory could be occupied by a foreign power. But we must never forget that during World War II, a portion of the United States was occupied, and it was occupied in those days, as today, because Alaska is a strategic location. And these lessons cannot and should not be lost to history. We all know the saying that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. The Japanese incursion occurred less than a decade after General Billy Mitchell testified that Alaska is indeed the most strategic place in the world. And the incursion taught our nation a vital lesson, that the defense of America begins in Alaska. Unfortunately, the lessons of the Aleutian Campaign and Alaska's strategic location are not lost on today's military planners. And just let me walk you through some of what we see in the state of Alaska right now, recognizing the proximity of Alaska to some of the hot spots around the world, whether it's North Korea, Russia, or China. Alaska is seeing a renaissance when it comes to our military presence. We see it at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, where Air Force F-22s and AWACS launched to acknowledge their Russian counterparts that are flying in the Air Defense Identification Zone. We see it at Eielson Air Force Base, which is preparing to receive 2 squadrons of F-35s beginning in 2020. We see it in the soldiers of the 4th Airborne Brigade Combat Team in Anchorage, who are now waiting deployment to Afghanistan. We see it in the soldiers of the 1st Stryker Brigade that will soon begin their training at the National Training Center rotation. We see it in the crews that are staffing ballistic missile radars in the state, looking very carefully at North Korea. And we also see it in the patriotic construction workers who will begin building the new long-range missile defense radar at Clear Air Force Station this summer. And then on the missile fields of Fort Greely, ready to intercept an ICBM aimed at the North American continent from wherever. We see it in the Navy SEALs that train in Kodiak, and in the Coast Guardsmen that protect our coastline all the way from Metlakatla in the south, all the way north to the Arctic. So I think it's clear, very clear, Madam President, that never again will the United States leave Alaska undefended? Which brings me back again to the characterization of the Aleutian Campaign as the forgotten battle. 75 years ago, U.S. and Allied troops were called upon to repel an invader who occupied U.S. soil. And we in Alaska particularly will never forget that fact, but neither should America. Ignoring the fact that war has been, in fact, waged on U.S. soil in this last century is a dangerous and a tragic thing. So let us resolve on this 75th anniversary of the start of the Aleutian Campaign that the forgotten battle shall be forgotten no longer. And as I prepare to leave the floor, Madam President, I would be remiss if I didn't add that at the remembrance event in Unalaska this weekend, it was not only an opportunity for many of the remaining evacuees to come together in Alaska. Some, it was their former community, others from the Pribilofs and from Kiska and Attu. It was a coming together, it was a homecoming for some. But there was also an effort to bring together many of our veterans who had served in the Aleutian Campaign, who their only exposure to the Aleutians was when they came in to defend that territory. And to have the exchange between those who had been forced from their homeland and those Americans, those veterans who had come to help, to have them united in a conversation for the first time ever was an exceptional American story. So over the course of 3 days, the sharing of stories was a remarkable opportunity for us. I had a chance to speak with one of our World War II veterans who said, I always knew what our part of the fight was about, but I had no idea how what we were doing from the war effort had impacted these displaced people, the original people of the Aleutian Islands. And to have that sharing, again, was a remarkable part of the story. And then to complete that picture, there were several individuals who were part of a Japanese film production company that were there to do the filming of, again, this 75th remembrance. Because as they said, this is an exceptional part of our history coming together too. And so recognizing, sharing that, and allowing the stories, again, to ensure that this is not forgotten. It was a very, very significant and I think healing opportunity for so many. So, Madam President, I thank you for the opportunity to share this important part of our history and ensuring that the forgotten battle is not forgotten. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.